The first stain was a ghost, a pale rust-colored specter on the floorboards where her husband had fallen. Eliza Miller scrubbed until her knuckles were raw, the lye soap biting into the small cuts on her hands. It did no good. The wood had drunk Tom's lifeblood deep, a permanent testament to the violence that had shattered her world. Winter was coming, a hungry wolf scratching at the door of the small cabin, and she was alone, save for her younger sister, Lily. The cold was more than just a season. It was a predator, and Silas Croft was its master. Eliza stopped scrubbing, her breath misting in the frigid air of the room. Her own reflection wavered in a shard of broken mirror propped on the mantelpiece. A woman hollowed out by grief and fear. Her face was gaunt, her eyes too large, shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep. She was a widow at 22, though in truth, she felt 1,000 years old. Tom had been a good man, a strong man, but he had stood between Silas Croft and the water rights to their small parcel of land. And so he was gone. The sheriff had called it a drunken brawl, a convenient fiction that left Croft's hands pristine and his path clear. Now, Croft was coming for the rest. Not with guns, not yet. He was a civilized tyrant, a man who wielded ledgers and legal notices like weapons of war. The debt notices had started arriving a week after the funeral, each one a paper cut to her soul. Tom's supposed debts, all mysteriously held by Croft's bank in the town of Redemption, were piling up like early snowdrifts. He was foreclosing. He was strangling her, slowly, methodically, waiting for her to break. He wanted the land, and he wanted her. She had seen the way he looked at her in town, a possessive, greasy appraisal that made her skin crawl. He would have her destitute, then offer his own brand of salvation. She had one last, desperate gambit. It was a madwoman's prayer, a thing born of sleepless nights and whispered conversations with Lily, who was too young to understand the full scope of their peril, but old enough to feel the gnawing chill of it. A worn copy of the Matrimonial Times lay on the table, its pages brittle. She had answered an advertisement. Not a plea for a blushing bride to join a prosperous rancher, but a strange, terse notice tucked in the back pages. Hardy woman needed for mountain life. No illusions. Must be able to withstand solitude and harsh winters. Send letter to general delivery, Redemption. CS. The men in town had laughed when she'd made inquiries. They'd told her who CS was. Caleb Stone, the beast of the Black Ridge. A one-armed mountain man. A hermit who lived so far up in the peaks he was more myth than man. A recluse, they said, scarred and half-wild. Some said he'd lost his arm to a grizzly. Others whispered it was in a bloody fight with deserters from the war. They called him an animal, a monster. The arrangement, facilitated by Croft's own smirking clerk at the land office, felt like a joke. They were sending the grieving widow and the orphan girl to the beast's lair, expecting them to be devoured by the wilderness or the man himself. It was a cruel, final twist of the knife. Let her run to the hills, Croft must have thought. The mountains would finish the job he'd started. Eliza looked over at Lily, who was huddled by the cold hearth, carving a piece of scrap wood with Tom's old knife. Her small face was pinched with concentration. Lily was all she had left in the world, the one pure, good thing. For her, Eliza would walk into the mouth of hell itself. And so she had. She had written the letter, a simple, honest plea. I am a widow with a 10-year-old sister. We are hardy. We have no illusions. We are not afraid of solitude. Please, a week later, a single, folded note had been waiting for her at the general delivery. It contained a crudely drawn map and a single word. Come. Now, their meager belongings were packed into 2 canvas sacks. The deed to the land, the one thing Croft couldn't yet legally seize, was sewn into the lining of her coat. She stood and pulled her worn wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind shrieked outside, a premonition of the journey to come. She was trading a civilized monster for a wild one, a gilded cage for an icy tomb. She didn't know if it was an escape or a death sentence. At this point, the two felt so terrifyingly similar that the distinction hardly mattered. All she knew was that they could not stay. Lily, she said, her voice rough. It's time. Lily looked up, her blue eyes wide and trusting. She carefully wrapped the knife in a rag, tucked her small wooden bird into her pocket, and stood up. She didn't ask where they were going, not really. She just knew they were going away from the place where Tom had died and where the sad-eyed men from the bank came to call. She slipped her small, cold hand into Eliza's. "Will he be nice, Liza?" she asked, her voice a small whisper against the wind's howl. Eliza squeezed her hand, the lie catching in her throat. "We will make a home, Lily. That's all that matters." She didn't answer the question. She couldn't. She didn't know the answer, and the truth she suspected was too terrible to speak aloud. Together, they stepped out of the cabin and into the biting wind, leaving the ghost on the floorboards behind. They were heading up, into the jagged teeth of the mountains, toward a man who was a ghost of a different sort. The journey was a pilgrimage into a frozen hell. The map was a cruel joke of sparse lines and cryptic landmarks, a lightning-scarred pine, a trio of granite boulders that looked like sleeping giants. The trail, if it could be called that, was a faint deer path that clawed its way ever upward, disappearing and reappearing under patches of early snow. For 2 days, they climbed. The air grew thin and sharp, burning their lungs with every ragged breath. The world of men, of towns and ledgers and polite cruelty, fell away below them, replaced by a brutal, indifferent majesty. The mountains did not care for their sorrow. The pines stood silent and sentinel, their branches heavy with snow. The wind that tore through the high passes spoke a language of pure, elemental force, a shriek that promised nothing but oblivion. Eliza's body screamed in protest. Her muscles, unused to such a climb, ached with a deep, throbbing pain. Her feet were numb inside her worn-out boots. But her pain was a distant thing, a buzzing insect at the edge of her awareness. Her entire being was focused on the small, mittened hand she held, and the small figure trudging bravely beside her. Lily was a marvel. Where Eliza saw only hardship, Lily found wonder. She pointed out the intricate frost patterns on a fallen leaf, the flash of a blue jay's wing against the gray sky. She treated the climb as a great adventure, her youthful resilience a stark contrast to Eliza's weary despair. But even Lily's spirit began to fray as the second day bled into a twilight the color of a fresh bruise. The snow began to fall in earnest, not the gentle flakes of a town snowfall, but a driving, blinding curtain of white. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Eliza's exhaustion. The map was a useless, sodden lump in her pocket. The landmarks were gone, swallowed by the storm. They were lost. The wind was a physical blow, stealing their breath and their warmth. Lily stumbled, her small face pale and pinched. "I'm tired, Liza," she whimpered, her voice nearly lost in the gale. "I'm so cold. I know, little bird. I know. Just a little further," but it was a lie. Eliza had no idea how much further it was, or even if they were still moving in the right direction. The world had shrunk to a swirling vortex of white and a growing terror in her own heart. This was it. This was how it ended. Croft wouldn't even have to get his hands dirty. The mountain would claim them, and they would become another of its grim secrets. She pulled Lily close, trying to shield her with her own body, a futile gesture against the overwhelming power of the storm. She sank to her knees in the deepening snow, a sob of pure desolation catching in her throat. It was the smell that reached her first. Wood smoke. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was a thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. Eliza lifted her head, sniffing the air like a desperate animal. There it was again, stronger this time, carried on a brief lull in the wind. It was coming from somewhere above them, further up the ridge. "Lily, do you smell that?" she shouted over the wind. Lily, her face buried in Eliza's coat, shook her head weakly. But Eliza was sure. With a surge of adrenaline born of last-ditch hope, she hauled herself and her sister to their feet. She had a direction now, a purpose beyond simply not dying. She stumbled forward, dragging Lily behind her, her eyes straining to pierce the whiteout, her entire being focused on that single, life-affirming scent. They found the cabin less by sight than by literally walking into it. One moment there was nothing but swirling snow and dark pines. The next, the rough-hewn logs of a wall were pressed against Eliza's outstretched hand. It was a low, solid structure, hunkered down into the side of the mountain as if it had grown there. A single window glowed with a faint, warm light, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. A thick plume of smoke billowed from a fieldstone chimney, a flag of defiance against the storm. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over Eliza. They had made it. They were alive. She half-carried, half-dragged Lily to the heavy plank door and raised a numb, trembling hand to knock. The sound was swallowed by the storm. She tried again, pounding with the last of her strength. For a long moment, there was nothing. The fear began to creep back in. What if he wasn't here? What if he wouldn't let them in? Then, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from inside. The door creaked open a few inches. A wall of warmth and the scent of pine and roasting meat washed over them. And in the gap, a single, piercing blue eye regarded them from the shadows. The man who stood in the doorway was less a man and more a piece of the mountain itself, carved from granite and old sorrows. He was huge, far larger than she had imagined, his frame filling the doorway completely. A thick, untrimmed beard, shot through with gray, covered the lower half of his face. His dark hair was long and shaggy. A web of old scars crisscrossed his visible features, the most prominent being a jagged, silvery line that sliced through one eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. He looked at them not with welcome, but with a flat, assessing stare that held no warmth whatsoever. But it was his left side that drew Eliza's horrified gaze. The sleeve of his deerskin shirt was pinned up at the shoulder, empty. The rumors were true. He was the one-armed beast of the mountain, and he looked every bit as savage and intimidating as the stories had claimed. He was an apex predator, and they had just stumbled, weak and helpless, into his den. "What do you want?" His voice was a low growl, a gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was not a question, it was a demand, a challenge. Eliza's throat was dry. The carefully prepared words she had rehearsed, the explanations, the pleas, all evaporated in the face of this terrifying reality. She could only stammer, her voice thin and reedy. "The letter, the advertisement. I'm Eliza Miller. This is my sister, Lily. His eye narrowed. A flicker of something, annoyance, confusion, crossed his face. He looked from her to the small, shivering form of Lily, who was peering out from behind Eliza's skirts with a mixture of fear and awe. He said nothing for a long moment, simply staring, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. The wind howled, pushing them forward, a gust of snow swirling into the warm room. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like stones grinding together, he stepped back. He didn't invite them in. He simply created a space for them to enter. "Get in before you bring the whole damn storm with you," he grated out. It was the least gracious invitation Eliza had ever received, but it was the most welcome. She scurried inside, pulling Lily with her, and he shut the door behind them with a heavy thud that sealed them in. The bar dropped back into place, cutting them off from the outside world completely. The silence in the cabin was suddenly more deafening than the storm outside. The cabin was a single, large room, and it was the man's personality made manifest. It was Spartan, brutally functional, yet impeccably clean and organized. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a whole log blazing within it, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Tanned hides covered the floor. On the walls hung an array of tools, traps, and weapons. A gleaming rifle and a shotgun were mounted over the mantel. A long, wicked-looking knife lay on a workbench next to a half-finished snowshoe. There was a single bed in one corner, a rough table and 2 stools in the center, and shelves laden with jars of preserves and dried herbs. It was a fortress, a den, a place built for one and for survival. There was no room for softness here. No room for them. He gestured with his chin toward the fire. "Get warm. Then you can tell me what kind of fool brings a child up this mountain in a blizzard." He moved past them, his stride surprisingly graceful for a man his size. He went to the fireplace and began to stir a pot hanging over the flames, the simple domestic act at odds with his savage appearance. He moved with a practiced, one-armed efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch, using his body and the stump of his left arm to brace and balance things with a skill born of long practice. Eliza guided Lily, who was shivering uncontrollably, toward the hearth. She stripped off their wet coats and mittens and hung them on pegs near the fire, her movements stiff and clumsy. She felt his eyes on her, an unnerving, constant pressure on the back of her neck. He was watching her, studying her, and she felt as transparent as glass. She sat Lily on a bearskin rug in front of the flames, chafing her small hands and feet, trying to bring the life back into them. "The advertisement," he said again, his back still to them. What advertisement? Eliza's heart sank. In the matrimonial times, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It said a hardy woman was needed. He stopped stirring. He turned slowly, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly in the firelight. The anger in his eyes was cold and sharp. I haven't placed an advertisement in any paper in 10 years. Not since. He trailed off, a muscle working in his jaw. That was for a housekeeper. And she left after one winter. He fixed her with his glare. Someone played you for a fool, woman. Or they played me. The truth of it hit Eliza with the force of a physical blow. Of course, it was a joke. A cruel prank orchestrated by Silas Croft and the sneering men of redemption. They hadn't just sent her on a fool's errand. They had forged the entire premise. They had sent her and Lily into the wilderness to die, using this man's old, forgotten advertisement as the bait. The humiliation was a hot flush on her cheeks, followed by a wave of cold, bleak despair. I see, she said, her voice hollow. The last ember of her hope had just been extinguished. They were not welcome. They were intruders, the punchline to a joke they hadn't even known they were a part of. I'm sorry. We didn't know. As soon as the storm breaks, we'll leave. He looked at her, then at the white fury raging outside the single window. That storm's not breaking for days. Could be a week. He ladled some of the thick, fragrant stew into 2 wooden bowls. He set them on the table with a clatter, along with 2 spoons. Eat, he commanded. You'll leave when the mountain says you can leave. Until then, you're here. The statement was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was not a comfort, nor was it a threat. It was a simple, unassailable fact, as hard and unyielding as the rock on which his cabin was built. They were trapped. Trapped with a man who clearly did not want them, in a place that could kill them, with a storm raging outside and a monster waiting for them back in the world below. Eliza looked at the steaming bowl of stew, then at her sister, whose eyes were already drooping with exhaustion in the overpowering warmth of the cabin. She had led them from one prison into another. The first 24 hours were a war of silence. Caleb, as he had tersely identified himself, moved about his small domain with a silent, brooding energy. He exuded an aura of contained violence, the way a large predator does even at rest. He sharpened knives, oiled his rifle, and mended a leather strap, each movement economical and precise. He ignored them, for the most part, acting as if they were 2 stray cats he had begrudgingly allowed in from the cold. He had given them a pile of furs to sleep on near the hearth, and had not spoken more than a dozen words since their arrival. Eliza was wound as tight as a watch spring. She sat on her stool, her back ramrod straight, every nerve humming with tension. She was acutely aware of his every movement, the way his one large hand could handle a heavy log with ease, the sheer, imposing bulk of him. She was terrified of him, of his silence, of the raw, untamed power he represented. He was a force of nature, like the blizzard that continued to howl outside, and she and Lily were small, fragile things caught in its path. Lily, however, was not afraid. After a long sleep, she had woken up with her natural curiosity restored. She watched Caleb with wide, inquisitive eyes, tracking his movements around the cabin. While Eliza saw a monster, Lily seemed to see something else. She saw the way he carefully banked the fire, the gentleness with which he handled a small, injured bird he had been nursing in a box by the hearth. The tension was a third presence in the room, thick and suffocating. Caleb was angry. Eliza could feel it. He was a man who had deliberately built a wall of solitude around himself, and she had breached it. She and her sister were a complication he had not asked for, a disruption to his hard-won peace. His resentment was a palpable thing, radiating from him in waves. He wanted them gone. And as much as she feared the wilderness and the man waiting for her back in redemption, a part of her wanted to be gone, too. Anywhere but under this man's intense, disapproving gaze. The breaking point, when it came, was small and quiet. Lily, bored and restless, had retrieved the small, half-carved bird from her pocket. She was sitting on the floor, trying to whittle it with Tom's knife, a tool far too large and sharp for her small hands. Eliza, lost in her own anxious thoughts, didn't notice until a small cry of pain. Ow! Eliza was on her feet in an instant. A bright bead of blood was welling up on Lily's thumb. It wasn't a bad cut, but in the charged atmosphere of the cabin, it felt like a catastrophe. Before Eliza could even react, Caleb was there. He moved with a swiftness that was startling in a man his size. He knelt beside Lily, his massive frame making her look impossibly small. "Let me see," he said, his voice still a low rumble, but lacking the hard edge it had held before. Lily, tears welling in her eyes, shyly held out her thumb. Eliza tensed, expecting a gruff reprimand, and "I told you so" instead. Caleb took Lily's hand in his own enormous, calloused one. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He examined the cut with a practiced eye. "Just a scratch," he murmured. He rose and went to a shelf, retrieving a small tin. He came back and knelt again, opening it. It was a salve of some kind, dark and smelling of pine and herbs. He carefully wiped the blood away with a clean rag and then, with a surprising delicacy, applied a small dab of the salve to the cut. "This will keep it from stinging," he said, his gaze fixed on Lily's hand. Lily, her tears forgotten, watched him, fascinated. "What is it?" "Pine sap and yarrow," he said. "Good for what ails you." He then looked at the knife lying on the floor and the small, lopsided block of wood. He picked up the half-finished bird. "This is what you're trying to make." Lily nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. "It's a blue jay?" "For Liza." To make her smile. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes then, a brief, unguarded expression that Eliza couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, a flash of shared understanding. He looked from the carving to Lily's earnest face. Without a word, he reached into the pocket of his own worn trousers and pulled out a small, folded clasp knife and a piece of pale, smooth wood. He unfolded the knife with a flick of his wrist. It was a small, well-worn tool, perfectly suited for carving. He handed it, handle first, to Lily. "This one's smaller," he said. "Easier for small hands. And this wood is softer. Basswood. It listens better." He then took the rough carving from her and, with a few deft, precise movements of his own larger knife, began to smooth the rough edges, his one hand working with an artist's skill. He showed her how to follow the grain, how to make the small, slicing cuts that brought the shape to life. Eliza watched, transfixed. This was the pivotal moment, though she didn't know it then. It was an act of unexpected, unadorned gentleness. The fearsome beast of the mountain, the scarred and silent hermit, was on his knees on the floor, patiently teaching a small child how to carve a bird. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had been alone for a very, very long time. In that moment, the fear that had been a cold, hard knot in her stomach began to loosen its grip. It was replaced by something else, something fragile and new and utterly terrifying, a flicker of trust. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a hostile, angry thing, but something more comfortable, companionable. The storm still raged, a wild symphony of wind and ice against the sturdy logs of the cabin, but inside, a fragile peace had taken hold. Caleb sat in his usual spot, sharpening his tools, but the rigid set of his shoulders had eased. Eliza found herself able to breathe more deeply, to look around the cabin not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. After Lily had fallen asleep, wrapped in a cocoon of furs by the fire, Eliza knew a debt had to be paid. Not a debt of money or obligation, but of truth. He had shown her a piece of his humanity. It was time she showed him hers. She took a deep breath. "Her father, Tom, my husband, he used to carve birds for her," she said softly into the quiet. Caleb didn't look up from the whetstone, but the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of steel on stone paused. That was his version of attention. "He was a good man," Eliza continued, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had broken. "He wasn't a fighter. He was a farmer. He loved the land. That's all he ever wanted, was to work our small piece of it and be left alone." She traced a pattern on the rough wooden table with her finger. "Silas Croft wanted our water. The creek that runs through our property is the only one that doesn't freeze solid in the high country. Croft is buying up all the small holdings to run his cattle. Tom wouldn't sell." She paused, the memory of that last day of fresh, sharp pain. Croft's men came. They said Tom owed money at the bank, gambling debts. Tom didn't gamble, but they had papers. They pushed him. He pushed back. They called it a brawl. They beat him to death. Right there on our own floor, her voice broke. "The sheriff is on Croft's payroll. Everyone is. They ruled it an accident. And then the foreclosure notices started. She finally looked at him, letting him see the raw grief and fury in her eyes. They told me in town that sending me up here was a joke. They thought the mountain would kill us. Or you would. They sent us here to die. Caleb set the knife and the stone down on the bench beside him. He finally turned and looked at her, his one blue eye holding her gaze. The firelight carved his scarred face into a mask of shadow and light. He looked ancient, weary. "I lost this," he said, his voice a low rasp as he gestured with his chin toward his empty sleeve, "at Shiloh. A cannonball took the arm and 2 men standing next to me. I came home, and the people, the ones who had clapped me on the back and sent me off with a flag waving, they looked at me like I was a ghost. A broken thing. They'd whisper when I walked by. The children were afraid of me." He picked up a small piece of kindling and fed it into the fire, his gaze distant, looking at a past only he could see. I tried to fit back in. But the world of men is loud. And it's cruel. So I came up here. The mountain doesn't judge you for what you're missing. It only cares if you can survive. People have mostly left me alone since." He looked back at her, and the chasm between them, the space filled with fear and suspicion, seemed to shrink. They were 2 different kinds of survivors, scarred by 2 different kinds of war, but they were survivors nonetheless. "Croft is a man who uses paper and money to do his killing," he said, his voice flat and hard. "I know the type. They are cowards, but their reach is long." He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling white abyss. "The storm will break in a day or 2. Croft will hear you survived. He won't like that. A man like that can't stand to have his jokes fall flat." He turned back from the window, and the comforting gentleness was gone, replaced by the grim pragmatism of a seasoned warrior. "He'll send men. Not with paper this time." The statement hung in the air between them, a cold, hard certainty. The peace of the cabin had been a temporary reprieve, a shared breath in the eye of the storm. But the storm was coming, a man-made one, and this time, there would be no running from it. Eliza looked at this one-armed giant, this man who had chosen solitude over a world that had rejected him, and she felt a new, different kind of fear. Not for him, but with him. For the first time since Tom's death, she was not entirely alone in her fight. The days that followed fell into a strange, domestic rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the howling gale outside. The blizzard showed no signs of abating, cocooning them in a world of white. The cabin became their entire universe. Caleb taught Eliza the subtle arts of survival in this harsh landscape. He showed her how to read the fire, how to bank it at night so a bed of hot coals would be waiting in the morning. He taught her which dried herbs made a calming tea and which could be ground into a poultice for wounds. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. She took over the cooking, turning his stores of dried meat and vegetables into savory, filling stews. He was used to functional, solitary meals, and the simple act of sharing a hot meal at the table was a novelty that he seemed to grudgingly accept, then appreciate. She mended his worn deerskin shirts, her needle and thread a small, domestic sound against the backdrop of his sharpening an axe or checking his traps on the sheltered porch. He, in turn, began to open up to Lily, and through her, to Eliza. He showed Lily how to identify animal tracks in the small book he owned, a well-thumbed volume with detailed sketches. He had a surprising knowledge of the stars, and one evening, he drew the constellations for her on a piece of slate with a lump of charcoal, telling her the old names for them. He was a man of deep, hidden knowledge, a scholar of the wilderness. One afternoon, he brought in a stack of flatboards from a lean-to outside. "The girl needs a bed," he announced, and proceeded to construct a small, sturdy cot for Lily, his one hand and the stump of his other arm working in a practiced, fluid harmony. He used the wall as a brace, his knee as a clamp, his teeth to hold a nail. Eliza watched, mesmerized by his competence. He was not a broken man. He was a man who had adapted, who had become stronger in the broken places. When he was finished, he laid a soft deer hide over it as a mattress. Lily, who had been watching the entire process with rapt attention, immediately climbed in, declaring it the finest bed in the world. These moments of shared domesticity were the mortar that filled the cracks between them. The initial tension had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect. Eliza found herself watching him, not with fear, but with a growing fascination. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the deep well of gentleness he kept so carefully hidden, the strict personal code of honor that governed his every action. He was the most honorable man she had ever met, second only to her late husband. And he watched her. He saw the steel spine beneath her grief, the fierce, protective love she had for her sister. He saw her quick mind, the way she learned and adapted. He had expected a soft, useless town woman. He had found a survivor, a woman forged in her own crucible of pain. He started to see her not as an intruder, but as a partner. The bonding was most evident in his interactions with Lily. The small, carved bird was now finished, a perfect, lifelike blue jay that sat on the mantelpiece. He was now teaching her to tie knots, showing her the intricate loops and twists for a bowline and a clove hitch. Lily, for her part, had adopted him completely. She would follow him around the cabin, chattering away, asking 1,000 questions, which he would answer with a gruff, surprising patience. She brought out a side of him that Eliza suspected he had thought long dead. She had brought him laughter, a sound that at first startled him, then seemed to settle in the small cabin as if it belonged there. One evening, as Lily slept soundly on her new cot, Eliza was patching a hole in Lily's dress by the firelight. Caleb was meticulously cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes a familiar, almost comforting sound. "You're good with her," Eliza said quietly. He grunted, not looking up. "She's not afraid." "No," Eliza agreed. "She's not." She paused, her needle still. I was terrified of you." He finally stopped and looked at her. "Most people are." It was a statement of fact, not a complaint. "Why did you let us stay?" she asked, the question that had been hovering between them since the first night. "You knew it was a lie. You could have thrown us out. You could have let the storm take us." He set the rifle aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his one hand clasped in front of him. The firelight played across the harsh angles of his face. "I came up here to get away from the cruelty of men," he said, his voice low and rough. "Throwing a woman and a child out into a blizzard, that felt like a thing they would do. Not a thing I would do." He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "And besides," he added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time, "I was out of coffee. I figured a woman from town would know where to get some, once the snow clears." It was a poor attempt at a joke, but it was more than that. It was an admission, an acceptance. He was thinking about a future that included them. A warmth spread through Eliza's chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I think that can be arranged," she said. Just then, a scratching sound at the door, faint but distinct, different from the howl of the wind. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, the gentle companion vanishing, replaced by the wary predator. He grabbed the rifle, his movements silent and fluid. He motioned for Eliza to move away from the fire, into the shadows. The scratch came again, followed by a low whine. Caleb moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. He listened for a long moment, then slowly, cautiously, lifted the heavy bar. He opened the door a crack, the rifle held ready. A man stood there, more a creature of snow and ice than a human being. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his beard a tangle of ice. It was Jedediah, an old trapper who lived even further up in the high peaks, a man Caleb sometimes traded furs with. He stumbled into the room, half frozen, and collapsed on the floor. Caleb knelt beside him, forcing a bit of whiskey between his blue lips. The old man coughed, sputtering. "Caleb," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "I saw down in Redemption. I had to warn you." "Easy, old man," Caleb said, pulling a fur over him. "Get your breath." "No time," Jedediah insisted, grabbing Caleb's arm with a claw-like hand. "It's Croft. He's in a rage. The whole town's talking about it. How the mountain man stole his woman. His pride is hurt. He's put a bounty out. Not a legal one. He's hired a dozen guns out of Sable Creek. Real hard cases. He's paying them a fortune to come up here and bring the woman and the girl back. And to kill you." The old trapper's eyes were wide with fear. They were buying ammunition, whiskey, boasting about what they'd do. "They're coming, Caleb." They were planning to ride out as soon as the storm showed the first sign of breaking. The cozy warmth of the cabin evaporated, replaced by an icy dread. The outside world, the world of men and their greed, had found them. Jedediah's warning was a death sentence. The fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered by a hail of bullets. Caleb looked from the old trapper to Eliza, his face a grim, unreadable mask. The time for mending shirts and carving birds was over. The time for war was upon them. The blizzard broke the next morning. The wind died down, and a pale, watery sun appeared, making the endless expanse of fresh snow glitter with a cold, cruel beauty. The world was pristine, silent, and deadly. Jedediah, warmed and fed, had already departed, melting back into the wilderness as silently as he had arrived. His warning lingered in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. Caleb stood by the window, staring out at the valley below. His posture was rigid, his jaw set. He was a general surveying a battlefield. "They'll come from the south," he said, not turning around. "It's the only approach a large group on horseback can manage, even in this snow. They'll be slow, but they'll come." Eliza came to stand beside him. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was mixed with a new, unfamiliar feeling, a grim resolve. This cabin, this small patch of mountain, had become her home. This man, this quiet, formidable giant, and her sister were her family. She would not let another man take her home from her. Not again. "What do we do?" she asked. Her voice was steady. He turned to look at her, a flicker of surprise in his eye at the steel in her tone. "You and the girl will hide. There's a hollow under the granite ledge behind the cabin. It's deep. You'll be safe there." "No," she said, the word sharp and final. It surprised her as much as it did him. "We are not hiding. I am not running anymore. Tom is dead because I didn't know how to fight. I will not let you die for the same reason." Her evolution was nearly complete. The grieving widow was gone, buried under the snows of the Black Ridge. A new woman stood in her place, one who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. He studied her face for a long moment, seeing the unshakable determination there. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was the highest compliment he could pay her. "All right," he said, "but you do exactly as I say." And so the fortification began. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress. Caleb was a master of defensive strategy. He had Eliza help him drag the heavy table and benches to barricade the single door. They stacked firewood against the inside of the walls for extra protection against stray bullets. The one small window at the back of the cabin was boarded up completely. The front window, the one that faced the southern approach, was left open but narrowed with heavy logs, creating a small, deadly firing slit. He worked with a terrifying, focused intensity. He checked his weapons, laying out the rifle, the shotgun, and a pair of pistols on a fur hide. He lined up cartridges, dozens of them, where they would be within easy reach. He was preparing for a siege, and it was clear he had done this before. The soldier who had been dormant for years was now fully awake. Then, he turned to her. He picked up the shotgun, a heavy, double-barreled beast. "You ever fired a gun?" "Tom's rifle," she said. "He showed me once, but I was never very good." "No time for rifles," he said. "A shotgun is more forgiving. You just point it at the thing you want to go away, and you pull the trigger." Both triggers, he handed it to her. The weight of it was immense, a solid, deadly thing in her hands. "It's going to kick. Hard. It'll feel like a mule just kicked you in the shoulder. You plant your feet, lean into it, and you hold on tight. You understand?" She nodded, her mouth dry. "This is my house," he said, his voice a low growl. "They are not welcome here. When they try to come through that door, you will stand right here." He positioned her in the shadows to the side of the entrance. "And you will make them unwelcome." He looked her directly in the eye. "Can you do that?" She thought of Tom, bleeding on the floor. She thought of Silas Croft's leering, triumphant face. She thought of Lily, her bright, innocent spirit. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and cold. "I can do that." He gave her another sharp nod, then went to Lily, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. He knelt in front of her, his voice softening. "Lily," he said gently, "we're going to play a game. A hiding game. I have the best hiding spot in the whole world. And you have to be the best hider ever. You have to be completely silent, like a little mouse in the wall. Can you do that for me?" Lily, her lower lip trembling, nodded bravely. He led her to the massive stone hearth. At the side, hidden by shadows and a stack of firewood, was a small, cleverly concealed door. He opened it. It led to a small, dark space within the chimney structure, a root cellar for keeping things from freezing. It was small, cramped, but it was the most protected part of the cabin. "In you go," he said softly. "And you don't come out until I come and get you. No matter what you hear. Do you promise?" "I promise, Cal," she whispered, using his name for the first time. She hugged him tightly around the neck, a fierce, desperate hug. He froze for a second and used to the contact. Then his one good arm came up and wrapped around her, holding her for a moment. He placed her inside, gave her a small kiss on the forehead, and closed the secret door. The cabin was silent again. The sun was climbing higher in the sky. It was time. Caleb took his position at the firing slit, the long rifle resting on the log. Eliza stood by the door, the heavy shotgun in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic, brutal rhythm against her ribs. They didn't have to wait long. They appeared as dark specks against the blinding white of the snow, a dozen riders moving slowly, their horses struggling in the deep drifts. They were a black stain on the pristine landscape, a creeping sickness moving toward the cabin. They grew larger, their shapes resolving into men, hunched against the cold, rifles held across their saddles. At their head was a man in a fine, store-bought coat, a man who sat his horse with an arrogant air. Silas Croft. He had come to watch. Caleb let out a slow breath. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Let them get close. Let them feel confident." The riders stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, fanning out in a loose semicircle. They were a motley collection of hard-faced men, their expressions a mixture of greed and cruel anticipation. "Stone." Croft's voice carried on the still, cold air, thin and reedy. "Caleb Stone, you have something that belongs to me. Send out the woman and the girl, and I'll let you live out your miserable days on this rock." Caleb didn't answer. He was sighting down the long barrel of his rifle, as calm and steady as the mountain itself. "Don't be a fool, you one-armed freak," Croft shouted, his voice rising with impatience. "There are 12 guns here. You can't win." "He's a coward," Caleb said softly to Eliza. "He has to monologue. He wants to feel like the master of the play." He adjusted his aim slightly. Now, the rifle cracked, the sound shockingly loud in the silence. It was a single, clean shot that echoed off the surrounding peaks. One of the riders, a big man on a gray horse, stiffened, a look of surprise on his face. He toppled sideways from his saddle and disappeared into the snow with a soft poof. He didn't move. For a second, there was a stunned silence. The remaining riders stared at their fallen comrade, then at the silent cabin. The easy bounty had just become deadly serious. Panic and rage broke their formation. They spurred their horses forward, yelping and firing their pistols and rifles wildly at the cabin. And the assault began. Bullets thudded into the thick logs of the cabin, splintering wood, a hailstorm of lead. Croft, the civilized tyrant, immediately spurred his horse back, retreating to a safe distance behind a line of trees, leaving his hired guns to do the dirty work. Caleb was no longer a man. He was a machine of lethal competence. He worked the rifle with a terrifying efficiency, the bolt action a blur of his one hand. Crack. A second rider fell. Crack. A horse went down, screaming, trapping its rider underneath. He was not just shooting. He was orchestrating a symphony of chaos, using his superior knowledge of the terrain and the angles to his advantage. The men were firing uphill into the sun's glare, their shots wild and panicked. He was in the shadows, calm, deliberate, deadly. Eliza stood frozen by the door, her knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. The sheer violence of the assault was overwhelming, a sensory overload of noise and fury. This was what Tom had faced. This raw, brutal hatred. And a cold, hard rage began to burn through her fear. They had taken her husband. They had tried to take her home. They were trying to take her daughter. They would not succeed. "They're coming for the door," Caleb yelled, never taking his eye from the sight. "Get ready." Two of the henchmen, dismounted and using the deep snow for cover, were rushing the cabin. They were big, ugly men, their faces contorted with effort and rage. They reached the small porch and threw their shoulders against the door. The wood groaned, the heavy bar holding firm. "Now, Eliza," Caleb roared. One of the men produced an axe and began hacking at the door. Chips of wood flew inward. A jagged hole appeared. An eye peered through, and then the whole door shuddered as they slammed a heavy log against it, using it as a battering ram. The bar splintered, cracked. The door flew open with a screech of tortured wood and metal. The two men stumbled in, blinking in the sudden dimness, their rifles half raised. For a split second, they were silhouetted against the bright snow outside. They were not prepared for the woman standing in the shadows, her face a mask of cold fury. Eliza didn't think. She acted. She brought the shotgun up, the way Caleb had told her, leaned into it, and pulled both triggers. The roar was deafening, a physical blow that slammed into her shoulder and sent her staggering back. The front of the cabin was filled with a cloud of black, acrid smoke. The two men were simply gone, thrown backward out of the doorway by the sheer force of the blast, their bodies torn and broken. The momentary lull was broken by a crash from the side of the cabin. Another henchman, cleverer than the rest, had smashed in the boarded-up rear window and was climbing through. He landed in a crouch, a long knife in his hand, a wolfish grin on his face. Caleb was still at the firing slit, dealing with the threat from the front. The man was behind him. He saw Eliza, saw she was fumbling to reload the shotgun, and his grin widened. He started toward Caleb's unprotected back. There was no time. The shotgun was useless. Tom's rifle was across the room. Eliza's eyes darted around, landing on the hearth. The heavy iron poker lay there, its tip still glowing a dull red from the fire. In a single, fluid motion born of pure, primal instinct, she lunged for it. The heat seared her hand, but she didn't feel it. She spun, the poker held in a two-handed grip like a sword, just as the man raised his knife to plunge it into Caleb's back. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure rage, and swung the poker with all her might. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening, wet crunch. He dropped like a stone, his knife clattering on the floorboards. He didn't move. Caleb spun around, his own knife now in his hand, his eyes wide. He saw the dead man on the floor. He saw Eliza standing over him, the red-hot poker in her hand, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. She had just saved his life. The abused wife, the grieving widow, had become a warrior. She had been reborn in the crucible of violence. Outside, the remaining henchmen, having witnessed the brutal, instantaneous deaths of their comrades at the door, had lost their nerve. Their numbers were halved, their confidence shattered. They were firing sporadically now, with no real conviction. Caleb turned back to the firing slit. Crack, crack. 2 more shots, 2 more men falling into the snow. The last few survivors had seen enough. They turned and fled, spurring their horses wildly down the mountain, not caring about their pay, only about escaping the one-armed demon and his fury. Silence descended again, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind through the broken door, and Eliza's ragged breathing. The battle was over. The siege was broken, but the architect of it all was still out there. Caleb moved past her, his face a grim mask. He picked up his shotgun from where it lay near the door, checked the loads, and stepped out onto the porch. He scanned the tree line where Croft had been hiding. Eliza, her senses still screaming, followed him out. The porch was a scene of carnage. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the stink of gunpowder. It's not over, she said, her voice hoarse. No, he agreed. He knew Croft. The coward would not be able to stand the humiliation. He would either flee, or he would do something desperate. And then they saw him. Silas Croft emerged from the trees, not on his horse, but on foot. He was dragging something with him. A small figure. Lily. He had circled around while the fight was raging and had somehow found the secret door to the root cellar. He had her. He held a small pistol to her head, his face a mask of sweating, terrified rage. I told you she was mine, he shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. You see, I always win. Drop the guns. Both of you. Drop them now, or the girl dies. Caleb's face went white. All the lethal calm, the cold efficiency, vanished. His one weakness, the one thing he had come to care for in this world, was now in the hands of his enemy. He slowly, reluctantly, lowered the shotgun. But Eliza did not. Her eyes were locked on Croft, on the terror in Lily's face, and on the pistol pressed against her sister's temple. The fear was there, a cold, sickening wave, but something else was there too. A clarity, a focus. She had been pleading, running, and hiding her whole life. She was done. Let her go, Silas, she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. She took a step forward. "Stay back," he screamed, his hand trembling, the gun wavering. "I'll do it. I swear to God, I'll do it." "No, you won't," Eliza said, taking another step. The shotgun was still in her hands, empty, useless as a firearm. But it was heavy, solid. "You're a coward, Silas. You always have been. You hide behind money and hired guns and pieces of paper. You can't even do your own killing." She was closing the distance between them. 10 yards. 8. Caleb watched, frozen, understanding her gamble, the life of his newfound family hanging on the frayed nerve of a madman. "You beat a good man to death when he was outnumbered," she continued, her voice a low, hypnotic cadence. "You terrorized a widow and an orphan, and now you hide behind a little girl. You are the smallest man I have ever known." Croft's face was contorted with rage and humiliation. Her words were striking him harder than any bullet. "Shut up," he shrieked, and for a fatal second, his focus shifted from Lily to Eliza. He took a step toward Eliza, dragging Lily with him, his intent to silence her, to wipe the look of contempt from her face. It was the opening she needed. It was the opening Caleb had been waiting for. In the split second that Croft's eyes were on Eliza, Caleb moved. He wasn't aiming for Croft. From this distance, with a pistol to Lily's head, the risk was too great. He was aiming for the gun. His own pistol, which he had drawn from his belt with lightning speed, barked once. The shot was surgical. The bullet struck the small pistol in Croft's hand, sending it spinning into the snow, shattering the delicate bones of his fingers. Croft screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock, dropping Lily and clutching his mangled hand. Lily scrambled away from him, running toward Caleb's outstretched arm. But Eliza was not finished. Her arc was not complete. The final confrontation was hers. As Croft stared in disbelief at his bloody hand, she closed the last few feet between them. She didn't fire the empty shotgun. She didn't need to. She reversed it, gripping the barrels, and swung the heavy wooden stock like a club. The butt of the gun connected with Croft's jaw with a solid, definitive crack. His head snapped back, and his eyes rolled up into their sockets. He collapsed into the snow, a puppet with its strings cut, utterly and finally defeated. Not by the one-armed mountain man, the legendary beast, but by the grieving widow he had tried to crush. Eliza stood over his unconscious form, her chest heaving, the shotgun held loosely in her hand. The world was silent, save for the drip of melting snow from the eaves of the cabin. She looked up and met Caleb's gaze. He was holding Lily tight, his one arm wrapped protectively around her, his face a mixture of awe, relief, and a deep, profound love. The resurrected phoenix had taken flight. The battle was won. The war was over. In the aftermath, a strange, almost holy quiet settled over the mountain. The bodies of the fallen henchmen were a grim testament to the morning's violence, dark smudges against the pure white snow. Caleb, with a grim and practiced efficiency, dealt with the grim necessity of it all. He dragged the bodies to a shallow ravine far from the cabin, a place the scavengers would soon find. It was the mountain's way, a cycle of life and death he understood well. Silas Croft was a different matter. He was alive, his jaw broken, his hand a mangled ruin. They tied him securely to one of his own horses. Caleb found the bounty money in Croft's saddlebags, a small fortune in gold coin. He looked at it, then at Eliza. "This is blood money," he said, his voice flat. "But it will buy a lot of coffee." A flicker of their earlier joke passed between them, a small spark of light in the grim reality. A day later, the honest marshal from a neighboring county, a man named Ferris whom Jedediah had also warned, rode up the trail. He was a tall, weary-looking man with honest eyes, a rare commodity in this territory. He looked at the carnage, at the bound and broken form of Silas Croft, and listened to Eliza's calm, clear account of what had transpired. He looked at the deed to her land, which she produced from the lining of her coat, and at the ledgers and fraudulent debt notices they had found in Croft's bags. Marshal Ferris nodded slowly. "I've been hearing stories about Silas Croft for years," he said, his gaze lingering on the broken man. "Never had enough proof to make anything stick. He was too rich, too powerful." He looked at Eliza, then at Caleb, his expression one of weary respect. "Looks like the mountain has its own brand of justice." He took Croft into custody, along with the evidence. He deputized Caleb on the spot to sign the formal complaint. Loose ends were being tied up. The law, the real law, was finally on their side. Croft's empire of fear and corruption would crumble. Eliza's claim to her land was secure. Lily was safe. Everything they had fought for had been won. As the marshal and his prisoner disappeared down the trail, a profound sense of finality settled over the cabin. The immediate threat was gone. The world was opening up again. Spring was a promise on the wind, the scent of damp earth beginning to emerge from beneath the melting snow. With this new season came a new, unspoken choice. The next morning, Eliza woke to the sound of Caleb moving about the cabin. He was packing a small canvas bag, a bedroll, a small sack of dried meat, his whetstone, his carving knife. The sight sent a pang of cold fear through her, a fear she hadn't felt even during the gunfight. He was a man of the wilderness, a creature of solitude. He had fought to protect them, had fulfilled his duty as he saw it. But his duty was done. The soldier had won the war, and now the hermit was returning. He was preparing to leave, to melt back into the high peaks where he belonged, to leave them to a world he believed he was not a part of. He was setting them free. He was breaking her heart. He saw her watching him. His movements faltered for a fraction of a second. He didn't meet her eye. He just continued to pack, his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. He believed his job was done. He was a temporary guardian, a force of nature that had intersected with their lives out of necessity. Now that the necessity was gone, he would retreat. He didn't understand that he had become the necessity. The trail down to redemption is clear now, he said, his voice gruff, his back still to her. You and the girl will be safe. The marshal will see to it. Croft's money, it'll be enough to fix up your place. Buy some stock. You'll be all right. Each word was a hammer blow. He was planning her future, a future that did not include him. He was giving her back her old life, not realizing that she didn't want it anymore. Her old life was a ghost, a memory. Her new life, her real life, had begun in this cabin, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a one-armed man patiently teaching her sister how to carve a bird. He slung the small pack over his good shoulder and picked up his rifle. He finally turned to face her. His one blue eye was guarded, his face an unreadable mask, but she could see the pain in the tight line of his mouth. This was hurting him, too. He was cutting out a part of himself, believing it was for the best. Cal, she said, her voice trembling. It's better this way, Eliza, he said, his voice low. I'm not the kind of man for towns. For people. You deserve a good life. A normal life. He started for the door he had barricaded to protect them, the door she had defended with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. He was just going to walk out of it. He was going to walk away. The crossroads was upon them, and he was taking the path back to solitude. But she, the woman who had faced down a dozen guns, was not going to let him go without a fight. Eliza moved to stand in front of the door, blocking his path. The repaired door, a symbol of their shared battle, was now the backdrop for the most important confrontation of her life. He stopped, his expression a mixture of confusion and sorrow. You are not leaving, she said. It was not a question. It was a declaration. Eliza, he started, his voice a low plea. You don't understand. A man like me. What kind of man are you, Cal? She interrupted, her voice rising with a passion that stunned him into silence. A man who takes in two freezing strangers even when he thinks they're part of a cruel joke? A man who gently tends a child's cut finger? A man who teaches a little girl about the stars? A man who stands between his home and a dozen guns to protect people he's only known for a week? Tears were streaming down her face, but they were tears of frustration and of fierce, desperate love. You talk about my old life, my old home. Don't you see? That place is filled with ghosts. Tom is there. The men who killed him are there. This, she said, her hand sweeping out to encompass the small, rough-hewn cabin. This is the only place I have felt safe since he died. This is the only place I have felt alive. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the turmoil in his eye, the battle he was fighting within himself. I'm not that woman anymore, Cal. The one who arrived here in the storm. That woman is gone. You, and Lily, and this mountain, you have shown me who I am. I am not a victim. I am a survivor. I am a fighter. She reached up and touched his scarred cheek, her touch gentle. He flinched, as if enused to such tenderness, then leaned into her hand, his eye closing for a brief second. My home is not a place on a map, Cal, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It's not a piece of land with a creek running through it. My home is where Lily is safe. My home is where I am strong. She looked him directly in the eye, her soul bared. My home is with you, if you'll have us. The plea hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful. It was the ultimate gamble, laying her heart open for him to either accept or crush. She was asking him to do the one thing he had spent years avoiding, to connect, to belong, to stay. His throat worked, but no words came out. He looked past her, toward the hearth where Lily was still sleeping soundly, a small smile on her face. He looked at the carved bird on the mantel, at the shotgun leaning in the corner. He looked at the whole world they had built together in the heart of the storm. A world of shared meals, quiet companionship, and fierce, bloody loyalty. Slowly, deliberately, he shrugged the canvas pack from his shoulder. It landed on the floor with a soft thud. He leaned his rifle against the wall. Then, he reached out his one good arm and pulled her against him, his hand burying itself in her hair. He held her tight, his whole body trembling with the force of his emotion. I am a man who has been alone for a very long time, he murmured into her hair, his voice thick and rough. I forgot what a home felt like. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his expression one of wonder, as if seeing the sun for the first time after a long winter. Stay, he said, the single word of vow, a promise, a prayer. Stay with me, Eliza. Both of you. He was choosing a life with her over a lifetime of solitude. He was choosing her. Relief and joy, so potent they were dizzying, washed over Eliza. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled his head down to hers. His kiss was not gentle. It was rough, demanding, a release of all the pent-up loneliness and fear and longing of a lifetime. It was the kiss of a man who had come home. Spring came to the Black Ridge not as a gentle thaw, but as a vibrant, riotous explosion of life. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, and the mountain slopes burst forth in a carpet of green and a profusion of wildflowers. The creek, the one Silas Croft had coveted, rushed clear and cold. It sung a constant murmur of renewal. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin on the mountainside had been transformed. The scars of the battle were gone, replaced by signs of a burgeoning life. The door was new, built from sturdy oak. A small garden, protected from deer by a rustic fence, was already showing neat rows of green shoots. A pen beside the cabin held a half-dozen chickens, their cheerful clucking a new sound on the mountain. Caleb was a changed man. The haunted, solitary hermit was gone. In his place was a man with a purpose, a man with a family. The gruff silence had been replaced by an easy companionship with Eliza and a fond patience with Lily. Laughter was now a frequent guest in their home. He moved with a new lightness, the weight of his past finally lifted. He had taken Croft's blood money and, with Eliza's shrewd guidance, had put it to good use. They had bought the finest breeding stock from 3 counties over, a small herd of hardy cattle that were now grazing in the high meadow on Eliza's land, the very land she had almost lost. Caleb's knowledge of the mountain, its seasons and its secrets, combined with Eliza's determination and the fertile land, was a potent combination. The townsfolk in Redemption, who had once mocked them, now spoke of the one-armed mountain man and his fierce wife with a mixture of awe and respect. They were no longer a joke. They were a force to be reckoned with. They were building not just a home, but an empire, founded on resilience and love. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the 3 of them sat on the porch of the cabin. Lily was between them, leaning back against Caleb's chest, her head resting on his shoulder as he patiently braided a strand of her hair. Eliza leaned against his other side, her head resting on his good shoulder, her hand resting on his knee. They were a perfect, unconventional, and utterly complete family unit. They watched the cattle grazing peacefully in the valley below, their valley. They're getting fat, Caleb observed, his voice a low, contented rumble. They are, Eliza agreed, a smile in her voice. By next year, we'll need more land. The old Miller place, down the valley, he mused. Good water there, too. I hear the bank is selling it cheap, she said, her eyes twinkling. He chuckled, a deep, warm sound that vibrated through her. He turned his head and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss full of the promise of 1,000 more sunsets just like this one. It was a kiss that spoke of shared trials and shared triumphs, of a future as vast and beautiful as the mountain landscapes spread before them. The beast of the Black Ridge had found his beauty, and in doing so, had found himself. The grieving widow had found her strength, and in doing so, had found her home. Together, in the heart of the wild, they had built a lasting peace.